Good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending this session on what I think is an extraordinary opportunity for a conversation about a historic moment in international affairs. And it is the situation of the United States, Iran, the international community, stability in the Middle East, security in the broader global community, and how energy markets and the energy world play into that. And for that discussion, we are extraordinarily lucky to have with us Ambassador Bill Burns. Bill Burns is really a legend in the State Department and in career diplomacy. He was a Deputy Secretary of State until November. Before that, he had served as the U.S. Ambassador in Russia and in Jordan. He had been an Assistant Secretary for the Near East Bureau. He is someone who has been thoroughly schooled in the world of global foreign policy in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. One of the things that Bill was extremely involved in was the beginnings of the outreach to Iran and the start of negotiations. But before we start to get into the details of what so many people are talking about today, deal between Iran and the Permanent Five members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, I think it's important to stop. And Bill, one of the things I would ask you is if you could help put this in context. Because here's a relationship for where more than 30 years, we were not just apart, we were enemies. And how does that set a context for all which is going on right now?
Well, thanks, Carlos, and it's very nice to be with all of you this afternoon to talk about this nice, easy, non-controversial issue. I think there are several points that are especially important to keep in mind as you think about the Iranian nuclear negotiations. The first is the most obvious, and that is that preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon remains an absolutely essential priority, not just for the United States, but I think for most of the international community. And I think the reasons for that are obvious. Especially over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a level of uncertainty and fragility and danger and risk across the Middle East that, at least in my professional lifetime, I haven't seen. And so a nuclear-armed Iran in that kind of context would multiply all those dangers and risks exponentially. So that's first. Second, I think it is important, as you suggested, to take a step back and look at the landscape of the Iranian nuclear negotiations over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's important to remember that there have been moments when a fixation on the perfect crowded out the good. And when you look in the rearview mirror, you can see moments that were missed that look a lot better now than they did at the time. When you remember that a decade ago, our European partners negotiating directly with the Iranians when the US was not a direct participant were trying to address the enrichment capacity challenge of about 64 relatively primitive centrifuges. And today we're trying to address the challenge of 19,000 installed centrifuges. Third, I think we have to acknowledge that we live in an imperfect world in which there are no perfect solutions. The Iranians have developed the know-how regarding enrichment technology, and Iranian scientists know their way around the fuel cycle. And it's not possible, as a matter of simple reality, to wish that away or dismantle it away or bomb it away. So the challenge, what we can do if we can't do that, is to sharply constrain that capacity over a long duration, to apply the most intrusive inspection and monitoring and verification procedures ever developed, and then to ensure that as sanctions relief is offered, it's in return for demonstrated compliance, and that you retain the possibility of reapplying that sanctions leverage in case of violations. Fourth, I think it's important also in an imperfect world to consider the alternatives, because diplomacy, like life, is a question of alternatives. And I think if you look at the other alternatives, whether a military option, which the president has not taken off the table, you see some obvious downsides. You could set back the Iranian program by a couple of years. But I think that would ensure that Iran would probably then make the decision to try to weaponize go underground, and you could also see a fracturing of the international coalition in support of sanctions that's been built up painstakingly over recent years. You could step up sanctions, but if you do that absent a connection to a serious negotiating process, you run the risk that the United States would be blamed for not being a fair partner in negotiations, and you could also see a crumbling of the international support for sanctions. So I think where that leaves us is with a recognition that the best of the alternatives we have before us is a strong negotiated agreement. Essential to the diplomacy to produce that agreement has been building leverage, and that's what the sanctions effort in the course of recent years has been all about. And it succeeded in part because of the efforts of administration as well as the US Congress, which played a very important role in this, but also because there's been a considerable degree of international support, which has had a real impact on the Iranian economy. As all of you know very well, a drop of more than 50% in Iran's oil exports, a drop of over 50% in the value of the currency. So that's a backdrop to negotiations. I think it's also important to embed our approach to the Iranian nuclear issue in a wider strategy in the region, because the reality is that Iran's behavior, as our friends in the region know very well, across a range of non-nuclear issues from Syria to Yemen, causes real problems and threatens not only our friends but our own interests. And so it's very important to be mindful of that and to convey that, which is why I think it's quite significant that President Obama will be hosting the 6 leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries at Camp David next month. And finally, I think it's important to remember that while the negotiating process has been an international effort, which has been absolutely crucial, reflecting the international support for sanctions, embedded within that is a very important element of direct diplomacy between the United States and Iran. And as you said, Carlos, after 35 years without sustained diplomatic contact, that's been a difficult challenge. But I think it's been absolutely essential for Americans and Iranians spending hours and hours face to face to be able to develop some confidence that from the point of view of Iran, sanctions relief is something that we'll follow through on if Iran demonstrates its compliance, and that we as Americans, along with our partners, can have the confidence that a set of intrusive inspection measures is going to be established and a set of constraints that are going to reassure all of us of the exclusively peaceful purposes of Iran's nuclear program. So, that's much easier said than done, but I think that's the backdrop against which it's important to look at the current negotiations.